All right, so we're going to be looking at the different functions that all living things have in common, what we call the characteristics of life. And the statement that IDBio uses is that unicellular organisms carry out all the functions of life. So we have to define what those are. All living organisms, from the smallest bacterium to the largest whale, share certain characteristics of life. And we have all the different kingdoms of life represented here: animals, plants, fungi, protists, and bacteria. The functional characteristics of life are the structural, biochemical, physiological, or behavioral traits shared by all living things. Even unicellular organisms have all of these characteristics of life. Life is also an emergent property, meaning that an emergent property would be a property that emerges only when certain ingredients are together at once. And so for life to emerge, there have to be these specific ingredients, which we don't necessarily know what those are, because we haven't been able to recreate life. There's a general consensus around the functional characteristics of life. This does not mean 100% agreement. Scientists still disagree on our definitions of life, and until we find other living things out in the universe, alien life, that we can vet our characteristics of life against, we can't be sure what the characteristics of life would be like for other aliens, but we do know that all life on Earth that we have encountered so far share these characteristics. So the first characteristic of life is that all life is composed of cells. All life has a cellular structure. This is according to the cell theory, that all living things are made up of at least one cell or more. Prokaryotic organisms, like this bacteria, are made up of one cell. They're unicellular, whereas eukaryotic cells that have a nucleus, they can be part of either a multicellular or unicellular creature. The second characteristic of life is that all life can recognize and respond to changes in environmental conditions. Even single-celled organisms can recognize what is going on around them and respond to changes in the environment. How do cells recognize their environment? Often the first step is stimulation of a certain protein that is embedded in the cell membrane. In E. coli, for instance, the uptake of arabinose sugar from the environment, this is the arabinose, triggers the production of enzymes necessary for its utilization as a nutrient source, meaning that the E. coli doesn't just produce these enzymes that digest arabinose all the time. It only produces them when arabinose is in the environment. And you can see that when it takes in arabinose, it starts expressing the DNA to make those enzymes. The third characteristic of life is that all living things can grow and or develop through a lifespan. Growth is the increase in size and mass of an organism, whereas development is the transformation of the organism through its lifespan. Even single-celled creatures like the amoeba will grow. If the parent cell doesn't grow, then each subsequent generation would be smaller than the previous generation, and of course you would run out of amoeba eventually. So the amoeba has to grow to a certain size before it splits in two. Metamorphosis, which happens in both the insects and amphibians, is the process of transforming from an immature form to an adult form in 2 or 3 more distinct stages. It's a really extreme form of development. In many multicellular organisms, like this tree, cell growth is influenced by hormones. The fourth characteristic of life is that all life has metabolism. Metabolism is defined as the countless chemical reactions that take place in cells and are responsible for all the actions of organisms. It's essentially the sum of all the chemistry that's happening inside one cell. And it's vast. Viruses lack metabolism. This is one reason we don't consider them to be living. You might say, well, how do viruses even work if they don't have a metabolism? Well, they need a metabolism to produce proteins, but they themselves don't possess it. They have to hijack another cell and use their machinery to produce those proteins. Enzymes are a big part of metabolism. They're a type of protein that will speed up metabolic reactions. And there's really two types of metabolic reactions. We can take all the chemistry in your cell and divide them into one of these two. Either anabolic reactions, which use energy. For instance, if I want to make a larger molecule out of smaller ones, I input energy to make chemical bonds between these atoms. Conversely, a catabolic reaction is where you take a larger molecule and you break it into smaller ones. And this releases energy because you're breaking those chemical bonds. So you can imagine with your metabolism, when you ingest food, you first break it down through catabolism, and then you take those micromolecules, those things that you got from breaking down the food, and you use energy to build molecules that you need for growth. The fifth characteristic of life is that all life maintains itself through homeostasis. Homeo means the same, and so what homeostasis means is that you're keeping your internal environment stable, even if your outside external environment might change. A really good example of this would be go outside on a really hot day. Your environment has changed. Maybe you inside had air conditioning, and as you go outside, and that abrupt change in temperature will cause your body to start sweating to cool down. And that sweating is an example of homeostasis. Many hormones function in order to maintain homeostasis. For example, insulin and glucagon help regulate your blood sugar. Anatomical organs like the kidney have functions that help maintain homeostasis. The kidney, of course, helps not just filter out our blood, but also get rid of excess water or excess salt. Paramecium are single-celled organisms whose cytoplasm contains a greater concentration of solutes than their surroundings. So they absorb water just naturally by osmosis. And to maintain homeostasis, they have to essentially pump that excess water out through what we call contractile vacuoles. And then this jackrabbit here has this adaptation of these giant ears, and those we think have evolved to help it cool down in the desert environment. The sixth characteristic of life is that all life has the capability for reproduction. Life creates more life. That's essentially the purpose of life. Life is just DNA replicating itself and finding ways to continue replicating. There's two types of reproduction out there. Sexual reproduction involves two parents and two different sex cells from each parent. Meiosis allows for a sexual life cycle with the fusion of gametes, gametes being sperm or egg. And sexual reproduction is beneficial in that it produces offspring that are genetically unique. It helps increase the genetic variation within a species. Of course, there are downsides to sexual reproduction. It requires time to woo a mate, to raise your offspring. Asexual reproduction, on the other hand, only involves one parent, and so it can be helpful when it might be hard to find a mate. These produce offspring that are all genetically identical to the parent, though, essentially clones of the parent. Binary fission and mitosis are both mechanisms of asexual reproduction. So you have actually both sexual and asexual reproduction happening within you as an organism. Asexual reproduction in the sense that your cells are dividing and replacing themselves through mitosis, and then sexual reproduction, which is happening in your gonads, your ovaries or your testes, as meiosis occurs. You can test yourself here to see if you can identify if they're sexual or asexual, these different creatures. The seventh characteristic of life is that all life exchanges energy and matter with the environment. All organisms use a source of energy for their metabolic activities. Almost all life on Earth uses the sun's energy in some direct or indirect way. Plants directly. Also, any sort of autotroph, which does photosynthesis, will directly take the sun's energy and create food with it out of molecules in the atmosphere, like carbon dioxide. Heterotrophs, like this seal or this penguin, they get energy from the sun as well, but it's indirectly, right? Because the base of the food web is where all the autotrophs are going to be turning sunlight into sugars, into food, which then gets passed up the food chain. So the seal is getting energy from the penguin, which got energy from the krill, which got energy from the phytoplankton, which got energy from the sun. We have discovered organisms that do not get energy from the sun, and they exist in the deep, dark areas of the ocean where sunlight cannot reach. And we believe that they get their energy instead geothermally from the center of the earth. Not only do all organisms use energy in some way, and we excrete metabolic waste matter. And so in us, we excrete through our lungs, carbon dioxide, our kidneys, urea, and our skin, sweat. In many plants, excretion occurs via leaves, roots, the stem. And in unicellular organisms, excretion occurs through the cell membrane, which is one reason why cells have to have a large surface area to volume ratio. By the way, I should have mentioned this probably at the beginning, but all these numbers are referring to essentially assessment statements, things that you're going to need to know at the end of 2 years for the IB exam. But we haven't gotten to these subjects yet. They're just referenced. So don't worry if you don't know what a photoautotroph is yet. The big picture is that you know that all life exchanges energy and matter with the environment. Finally, our 8th characteristic of life is that at the population level, life can adapt and change over time. This characteristic is tricky because a life, one living thing, cannot do this characteristic. But life as a whole, life as a species or as a population can. This occurs as a result of evolution by natural selection, and it has to happen at the level of the population. One creature by itself can't evolve, but a population can evolve and adapt to its environment. All living things do this because their environment changes over time. When a population is evolving, the ratio of different genetic types in the population is changing. But each individual organism's genes do not change. We'll get more to this when we get to evolution. But here we see the brown rabbit is more adapted to its habitat than the white rabbit. If I was a predator, the white rabbit would be a lot easier to pick out and eat. But if I was to change the environment, and let's say pretend this is a snowy area, the white rabbit would probably blend in. And so it's really the environment that determines how successful you are as a creature. All right, and that is the end of characteristics of life.